If you're here to uncover the story of India's lost maritime empire, then you have come to the right place. Now, when you picture ancient India, you're probably thinking of vast land empires, right? Maybe some majestic palaces, dusty trade routes. But what if I told you that one of the biggest parts of that picture is completely missing? What if India's grandest story wasn't written on land at all, but across the open ocean? Well, we're about to dig into a forgotten history of incredible explorers, truly revolutionary technology, and naval superpowers that will completely change the way you see the ancient world. Let's get into it.
So, let's just tackle the big myth head-on. We're often taught this image of ancient India as a civilization that was pretty much defined and even confined by its land, a culture that was mostly focused inward. But honestly, that picture isn't just a little bit incomplete, it's just plain wrong.
The reality is, from the earliest of days, Indian sailors were pushing out across the oceans, connecting entire continents and shaping cultures wherever they went. You see, this maritime heritage wasn't some tiny footnote in their history, it was the main event. And I think the best way to really grasp this is to start with the story of one absolutely incredible adventurer.
To do that, we've got to go all the way back to the 1st century CE to meet a man whose journey would literally help create a new civilization in Southeast Asia.
This is the legend of Kaundinya. He was an Indian Brahmin who set off on this unbelievably epic voyage all the way to the Mekong Delta. And when he gets there, he meets and marries the local ruler, a Naga princess named Soma. But this was so much more than just a marriage. It was a symbolic and very real fusion of two totally different cultures. And from that union, a powerful new kingdom was born. And that kingdom was Funan. For over 500 years, Funan wasn't just some remote outpost, it was a dominant force in the entire region. It was this cosmopolitan hub with strong diplomatic ties to both China and India. It basically became a critical link in the ancient world's global supply chain, a crossroads connecting the markets of the Roman Empire with the workshops of Han China.
Okay, but that brings up a massive question. We are talking about voyages across thousands of kilometers of open ocean 2,000 years ago. No modern engines, no GPS. How on earth did they actually do it? Well, the answer lies in a piece of truly brilliant technology.
You see, they didn't have steel, but for the wild waters of the Indian Ocean, they had something way better. It was a totally revolutionary way of building ships that pretty much turned conventional wisdom on its head.
They built what we now call stitched ships. So instead of using rigid iron nails to fasten the hull together, shipbuilders literally sewed the wooden planks to one another with incredibly strong rope. I know, it might sound a little primitive, but it was absolute genius.
And here's why it was so incredibly effective. A ship built with iron rivets is stiff, so when a huge wave smashes into its side, all of that force goes right to the rigid joints, and they can snap. But a stitched ship, it was flexible. It was designed to bend and move with the waves, spreading that stress across the entire hull. And beyond that, avoiding iron was just practical. It stopped the ships from rusting in that corrosive salt water. Plus, there were all these great old sailor legends about magnetic rocks on the seafloor that could literally pull iron-nailed ships to their doom. Legend or not, these stitched ships were totally immune. And their mastery of materials was just as impressive. They used teak wood, which is naturally resistant to rot and super strong. The ropes they used were woven from coconut coir, which doesn't fall apart in salt water. And they waterproofed all the seams with this special pitch made from cashew nuts. And look, we're not talking about small rafts here. Ancient texts like the Rig Veda describe massive 100-oared vessels that could carry hundreds of men across the high seas.
And this amazing technology wasn't just for a handful of explorers. Oh no, it was the engine that powered some of history's most formidable naval empires.
This advanced shipbuilding was the backbone of sophisticated, state-level naval forces that projected their power and dominated the seas for centuries on end.
Let's look at two of the heavy hitters. Way back in the 3rd century BCE, the Mauryan Empire had a navy so organized that it was a formal department of the state. It was run by an official called the Navadyaksha, the superintendent of ships. This was a professional navy, not just a bunch of fishing boats. Then, you fast forward to the 11th century and you've got the Chola dynasty. And these guys were a true naval superpower. In 1025, they launched one of the greatest amphibious invasions in pre-modern history, sending a fleet all the way across the Indian Ocean to attack the Srivijaya Empire in Indonesia. It was a strategic masterstroke to seize control of the Strait of Malacca, which was the key choke point for pretty much all of the world's maritime trade.
This ability to mobilize huge fleets was just deeply baked into the culture. I mean, to get a sense of the scale they were thinking on, the ancient epic Ramayana describes a king demanding a fleet of 500 boats, each with 100 ferrymen,
just across a river. This points to a really deep cultural and logistical comfort with large-scale naval operations, whether on rivers or the open ocean.
So the long-term impact of all this maritime activity was absolutely immense. It led to what historians now call the Indianization of Southeast Asia. But here's the key part. This was not an empire of conquest. It was an empire of influence. Religion, art, language, political ideas, they all traveled on these ships, spreading through peaceful exchange and trade, not by the sword.
Which brings us to the great mystery in all of this. If we have the literary records, the archaeological proof, and even accounts from other cultures, how did this incredible maritime legacy get almost completely erased from our popular history?
Well, the answer has to do with a dramatic shift in global power, and, more importantly, with who was writing the history books for the last 500 years or so.
The historian K.M. Panikkar gave this turning point a name, the Vasco da Gama epic. It all starts in 1498, the year the first Portuguese ship sailed into an Indian port. That single moment kicked off a completely new era, one that would be defined by the steady rise of European naval power in the eastern seas.
But before that moment, it is so important to understand what the world actually looked like. As the historian K.N. Chaudhary put it so perfectly, the great Asian civilizations were the first world. They were the epicenters of economic power, technological innovation, and cultural production.
So what happened? Well, colonial-era historians started writing narratives that, not surprisingly, emphasized their own naval supremacy. In these new histories, Asian powers were often depicted as static, weak, or exclusively land-based. The absolute genius of technologies like the flexible stitched ship was just dismissed as primitive because it didn't use iron nails, completely missing the sophisticated design behind it. And in the end, millennia of dynamic, Asian-led maritime history were just sort of sidelined and eventually forgotten.
So, let's bring this all back together and take a look at what this rediscovered legacy is really telling us. We've seen this powerful three-part legacy really come into focus. It all started with daring individuals, explorers like Kaundinya, who sailed into the unknown. It was made possible by brilliant homegrown technology like the stitched ship, and it culminated in organized naval empires like the Mauryas and the Cholas, who shaped the destiny of an entire hemisphere.
So the main takeaway here is this. Far from being a landlocked civilization, ancient India was a thalassocracy. That's a true maritime power, whose sailors, merchants, and fleets were a defining force across the eastern seas for thousands of years.
And that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other incredible stories, what other forgotten chapters of our own human history have just been paved over, waiting for us to rediscover them? We've seen how bold explorers, brilliant technology, and powerful empires forged a forgotten maritime legacy. If this journey into a lost world was as fascinating for you as it was for me, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing. And definitely let me know in the comments what other forgotten histories you think we should tackle next. Thanks so much for watching.